everyone. Welcome again to our lecture in Practical Research 2, Quantitative Research. We are now in our second lesson of our topic in Chapter 1, entitled The Importance of Quantitative Research Across Fields. Our objective for this lesson is for us to illustrate the importance of quantitative research across different fields like psychology, education, medicine, communication, and as such. But before we begin, let us do first a recap in our previous lesson. Our previous lesson talks about the nature of inquiry and research. So in here, we discuss the nature of inquiry and research, together with the characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses of quantitative research. And finally, we identify and explain the different kinds of quantitative research, such as true experimental and quasi-experimental researches, and non-experimental or descriptive researches, such as survey, correlational research design, evaluative researches, and others. So I just hope that you already had a full understanding of our lesson. So now, let us proceed with our next lesson, Importance of Quantitative Research Across Fields. Okay, so let's begin our lesson, Importance of Quantitative Research Across Fields. People do research to find solutions, even tentative ones, to problems in order to improve or enhance ways of doing things, to disprove or provide a new hypothesis, or simply to find answers to questions or solutions to problems in daily life. Research findings can affect people's lives, ways of doing things, laws, rules, and regulation, as well as policies, and among others. So one example is this picture. So are you familiar with this building? So this is found in Taiwan. This is called the Taipei 101. So we all know that these are the improvements made by engineers when it comes to building structures, just like this skyscraper. Through rigorous, painstaking, and mind-blowing research and study, they were able to come up with a building that can withstand a powerful earthquake. What's inside the building, what stabilizes the building is this ball. So this is called the tuned mass damper, or the TMD. The TMD is the one responsible in stabilizing the Taipei 101 from the devastating effects of earthquake. A TMD reduces the amplitude of vibration by absorbing kinetic energy from the system. In this case, the swaying motion of a tall building. For a long time, TMDs were relegated to areas with the rest of the building's mechanical equipment hidden from public view. So that changed in 2004 when the Taipei 101 tower finished construction in Taiwan. Rather than hide the world's largest spherical tuned mass damper, the building's designers chose to open it to the public. So that's one of the improvements, okay, or that enhance the way of living of every people in the world. So the quantitative research, because of its emphasis on proof rather than discovery, it has been widely used in most disciplines. In the natural and social sciences, quantitative research is the systematic, empirical investigation to observable phenomenon via statistical, mathematical, or computational techniques. So we usually use statistics or math in order for us to generalize our findings. The objective of quantitative research is to develop and employ mathematical models, theories, and hypotheses pertaining to phenomenon. The process of measurement is central to quantitative research because it provides the fundamental connection between empirical observation and mathematical expression of quantitative relationship. Let us discuss the importance of quantitative research in anthropology. Anthropology is defined as the scientific study of humans, human behavior, and societies in the past and present. There are three types of anthropology in our context. We have the social anthropology, we have the cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. So the social anthropology, this studies the pattern of behavior. The cultural anthropology studies the cultural meaning, including the norms and values of people. And the linguistic anthropology, this studies how language influences social life. According to Bernard in 1994, he says that there are 5 steps to follow in conducting 3 experiments with people. So you can employ experimental researches in anthropology. So the first step is for you to determine at least 2 groups. This is called the treatment group. It is also known as the intervention group or the stimulus group or the experimental group. And the second one is the control group. One of the group gets the intervention, for example, a new drug, and the other group, the control group, doesn't. As we had explained in our last lecture, that this is what we usually employ or give to these groups placebo, in which they're also given interventions, but the drugs that are given to them doesn't have any medicinal or therapeutic effect at all in their bodies. The second one is that individual must be randomly assigned either to the intervention group or to the control group to ensure that the groups are equivalent. Some individuals in a population may be more religious and more wealthy or less sickly or more prejudiced than others. But random assignments ensures that all those traits are randomly distributed through the groups in an experiment. The degree to which randomization ensures equivalences, however, depends on the size of the groups created. With random assignments, 2 groups of 50 are more equivalent than 4 groups of 25. So what is the purpose of this? In order for you to strengthen the internal validity of your research study. The third one, according to Bernard, is that the groups are measured on one or more dependent variables. Just like, for example, the income, the infant mortality, attitude toward abortion, knowledge of curing techniques, or other things you hope to change by the intervention. This is called the pretest. And the fourth one, the intervention, the independent variable, is introduced to the samples, to the treatment group, of course, and to the control group. You're also giving intervention through placebo. And number 5, the dependent variables are measured again, and this is what you call the post-test. So this is usually the 5 steps, according to Bernard, in order for you to conduct experiment among people. So there are 2 experiments in the laboratory. So according to Bernard, he further says that 3 experiments with people are commonly done in laboratory and in the testing of new medicine. So in the laboratory, these experiments often produce results that beg to be tested in the natural world by anthropologists. In 1959, Aaron and Mills, cited in Bernard, demonstrated in a lab experiment that people who go through severe initiation to a group tend to be more positive toward a group than are people who go through a mild initiation. The reason that people who go through tough initiation rites put a lot of personal investment into getting into the group. Later, if people see evidences that the group is not what they thought it would be, they're reluctant to admit the fact because of the investment. When they are done outside the lab, experiments are usually called field experiments. Janet Schofield and her colleagues did a 3-year ethnographic study of a middle school during the first year. So in this study, they noticed that African American and white children seem to react differently to mild aggressive acts, things like bumping in the hallway, poking one another in the classroom, asking for food, or using another student's pencil without permission. There appeared to be no event of racial conflict in the school, but during interviews, white students were more likely to report being intimidated by the African American peers than vice versa. So this is one of the experiments of uh, Janet Schofield and her colleagues using anthropology. So this is how you will employ or approach or apply experiments in anthropology. It can be in the laboratory, clinical setting, which is a true experiment, or in the field or the field experiments. So quasi-experimental research is also employed in using anthropology or in the study of anthropology. Quasi-experimental research are the most often used in evaluating social programs. For example, if you wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of performance tasks in employing this grading system in the K-12. So in here, suppose a researcher has invented a technique for improving reading comprehension among third graders. He or she, the researcher, selects two third grade classes in the school district. One of them gets the intervention and the other doesn't. So two-thirds. Students are measured before and after the intervention to see whether the reading scores improve. So you already had this what we call the pre-test and the post-test. And in between that, intervention was given to see whether the reading scores improve. So the reading scores usually is the dependent variable. This design contains made of the elements of a true experiment, but the participants are not assigned randomly to the treatment and control group. So meaning in quasi-experimental research, as we had discussed previously in the different kinds of quantitative research, that quasi-experimental research lacks randomization compared to true experimental researches. So we say lack randomization. The participants of the study, particularly the treatment and the control group, were not assigned based on chances, or they're not selected randomly, but based on the arbitrary selection done by the researcher or upon the judgment of the researcher. Okay, another type of experimental research that can be employed in anthropology to people is the one-shot case study or the one-group post-test only design. So in this one-shot case study design, a single group of individuals is measured on some dependent variables after an intervention has taken place. The researcher tries to evaluate the experiment by interviewing people and trying to assess the impact of the intervention. The problem here, of course, is that you can't be sure that what you observe is the result of some particular intervention. One example in our context is that in the 1950s, physicians began general use of the pap smear. This is a single procedure for determining the presence of cervical cancer. So this is an example of a pap smear. So usually, the doctor who is performing this in his clinic or in the minor surgical room is that he will try to get a tissue sample in the cervix in order for them to determine if there is any malignancy on that particular sample. So that is an example of pap smear. Following the introduction of the pap smear, measurements were made for several years to see if there was any effect. Sure enough, cervical cancer rates dropped and dropped. But later on, it was noticed by the physicians or the physicians conducting the research that cervical cancer rates has been dropping steadily since the 1930s. Of course, that was way before the introduction of a pap smear by this researcher in the 1950s. Of course, early detection of any cancer is important in fighting the disease, but the data from the 1930s and 1940s shows that initially, at least, the pap smear was not responsible for lower rates of cervical cancer. In this study, the intervention, which is the pap smear, were only introduced in the 1950s by the researcher, the physicians. It is noted that through the intervention of pap smear, cases of cervical cancer is dropping continuously. It can be inferred in their study that pap smear as a diagnostic procedure in detecting early stages of cervical cancer is an effective tool in stopping or reducing the incidence of deaths related to cervical cancer. But based on the findings, it was noticed, unfortunately, the rate of cervical cancers was already dropping early on since 1930s and 1940s, before the pap smear was introduced by the researchers. Of course, in this study, the internal validity is compromised. Another example in the one-shot case study design is that one such design might be a one-off survey of unemployed people in a specific local area to assess their health status on the impact of unemployment on health. So in this study, pretest was not done by the researcher. The subjects who were the unemployed workers were only measured based upon their health status during the time that they were already unemployed for several, probably months or years. So internal validity in this case study or one-shot case study is also compromised. Another study or design that can be used for anthropology is the two-group post-test only design. For this research design, according to Bernard in 1994, he cites this example. He considers two villages in the same cultural region. One village has experienced a major intervention. The intervention given to this village is they introduced tourism, a factory, and an immigration system in which people might live there in that area, which came from another place. While the other village doesn't have any intervention at all. You measure a series of variables. So these variables, after the intervention, post-test was given, and the dependent variables that you need to measure is the income, the attitudes toward national government, and the amount of time women spend in child-rearing activities in both villages. So this is the village 1 or the 01 and the village 2, which is the 02. So this is an illustration of the example. So one village was given treatment or intervention such as the introduction of tourism, a factory, and an immigration system, while the control group, which is another village, was not given any. You measure a series of variables, the income, attitude towards the national government, the amount of time women spend in child-rearing activities in both villages, right after the treatment introduced in the experimental group. This is called the two post-tests employed to both villages. If the differences between village 1 and village 2 are small, you can tell if the intervention caused those differences. What is the treatment? The introduction of tourism, the a factory, and an immigration system. This design is quite convincing though when the difference between the village 1 and the village 2 are large, and where you have a lots of participants' observation data to back up the claim that intervention is responsible for those differences. Another design in experimental research that you can employ in anthropology is the one-group pre-test post-test design. In the group pre-test post-test design, some variables are measured or it is observed. Then the intervention takes place, and then the variables are measured again. This takes care of some of the problems associated with the one-shot case study, but doesn't eliminate the threats of history, testing, maturation, selection, and mortality. Most importantly, If there is a significant difference in the pre-test and the post-test measurement, we can tell if the intervention made that difference happen. This is according to Bernard. So this is one illustration of the one group pre-test post-test design. So for example, you want to determine whether praising primary school children makes them do better in mathematics. So in the experimental group, you conducted a pre-test, and then you give the treatment, and then you observe their scores in mathematics. So that is the post-test. So in here, there is what we call problems when it comes to maturation. Why? Because period between pre-test and post-test is so long. So subjects may have already matured because of developmental changes. And number two, the testing itself is all compromised, in which testing is the period between the pre-test and the post-test is too short, and there is the possibility that subjects can remember the questions and answers. So this is one of the internal validity that you need to look for in the one group pre-test post-test design. So what is maturation, by the way? This is a passage of time that influences the dependent variables. As we can see here, the period between the pre-test and the post-test being conducted. So if the period is too long, it will compromise the maturation of your data. And in the testing, the pre-test used to establish a baseline affects the result of the post-test. So in here, the period between the pre-test and the post-test is too short. So meaning that if the period is too short, the subjects right after the post-test might still remember the questions and the answers on that particular pre-test and post-test. So let us proceed to the importance of research and medical education. Quantitative research in medical education tends to be predominantly observational research based on the surveys or correlational studies. Experimental research designs may enhance the quality of medical education. Said designs test intervention like the curriculum, teaching learning process, or assessment with an experimental group. Either a comparison or control group of learners may allow researchers to overcome validity concerns and infer potential cause-effect generalization. When designing their own or evaluating other researchers' studies, researchers must always keep in mind internal and external validity concerns. So let us try to differentiate between the two. Internal validity has to do with the degree to which the intervention can be said to have independently produced the desired change in behavior, all other external variables being ruled out as to their possible contribution to the change. So internal validity refers to the degree of confidence that the causal relationship being tested is trustworthy and not influenced by other factors or variables. On the other hand, external validity speaks to the effectiveness of the intervention in the other setting, environments, and other persons outside of the original research setting. In other words, external validity refers to the extent to which results from study can be applied, generalized to other situations, groups, or events. So this is another example of validity. So this will show how legitimate the experiment is. So the selection of a research design for any study should be within the parameters of the research questions, as stated in the problem statement or hypothesis. In quantitative research, the findings will reflect the reliability and validity, or what we call psychometric characteristics of the measured outcomes or dependent variables such as changes in knowledge, the skills or attitudes used to assess the effectiveness of medical education intervention, or the independent variable of interest. Let us now proceed to the importance of quantitative research and communication. So in here, researchers are often interested in how understanding of a particular communication phenomenon might be generalized to a larger population. For example, researcher can advance questions like what effects do punitive behavioral controls statement have on a classroom? So punitive statement includes shaming, shouting, insulting, and others. So how does this affect the students, particularly in the way they deal with other people, like their classmates? Does this contribute to the increased incidence of bullying, or probably this is a what you call the this will contribute to a bad behavior or probably study habits in which most of the time uh, students will tend to drop from schools or probably will have a lower academic performance. Another example is what communicative behaviors are associated with different stages in a romantic relationship. So this communicative behavior is, for example, giving of letters, giving gifts like flowers and chocolates, take care messages, okay, assisting the others in any sort of, and others. So in here, in this kind of study, you will be able to see what are the communicative messages in the different stages of romantic relationship, so that we will be able to understand and how people respond to these communicative messages. Is it positive or is it negative? The other example is what communicative behavior are used to respond to coworkers displaying emotional stress. So communicative behavior like being quiet, tapping at the back, or hugging, and others. So we can see here that we can employ quantitative research in particular descriptive design to understand how people respond to words, gestures, cliches, and as such, and how it affects their individual lives. They construct either constructively or destructively. In here, research is an avenue to understand people, improve their way of life, and make our world a better place to live in. So how about in sports medicine? The importance of quantitative research in sports medicine. Quantitative research done by the University of Eastern Finland investigated the relationship between the mushrooming of fast food chains and obesity of children, as well as the intervention needed to prevent the children's obesity from reaching serious proportions. The research study employed or selected 410 children with ages ranging from 6 to 8 years old from Kuopio, Eastern Finland. The researcher focused on the children's physical activity and physical inactivity and the concomitant impact on the children's amount of adipose tissue, or what we call the fat mass, and the endurance fitness. The study showed that children who did strenuous exercise for 10 minutes daily had 26 to 30% less adipose tissue than their peers who were physically inactive. It has also been found that even light physical activity for the equivalent time of passive sitting reduced the children's adipose tissue by 13%. The study concluded that physical activity affects effectively the children's weight control. So in here, descriptive researches in or clinical or field experimental research design can be used in sports medicine to understand the effects of such intervention or health practices of an individual or group of people that will improve health on medical conditions, thus preventing debilitating or non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, heart disorders, and others. Okay, let's try to find out the importance of quantitative research with behavioral sciences. Contemporary quantitative scholars are interested in two types of questions. The first one is the question of relationships, and the second one is the questions of differences. The first one is the relationship questions. This tends to explore how one behavior exhibited by people is related to another type of behavior. For example, the relationship between verbal aggression and physical aggression. So is it when a person has a high level of verbal aggression tends to also have to be physical aggressive? So in here, we will try to find out if it is uh, there is a proportional relationship between the two, verbal aggression and physical aggression. The second question is the relationship between the communication skills of supervisor to the emotional experiences of the employees. So, are the supervisors, when they have a good communication skills, affects positively the emotional experiences of employees? And in the same way, if the communication skills of the supervisor is negative, uh, this will also affect the emotional experiences of employees negatively. So you will try to find out the relationship between the two variables. The second one is the question of differences. This explores how patterns of behavior or perceptions might differ from one group or type of persons to another. So you'll try to differentiating or try to compare the two groups when it comes to one particular behavior. So do people with disabilities experiences emotional labor differently from those without disabilities? You're trying to differentiate the um, emotional labor or the experiences of emotional labor between two people, those with disabilities, and the other one is those without disabilities. The second example is that do women perceive talkativeness differently from men? So you're trying um, to differentiate the communication skills of men and women when it comes to talkativeness and being silent or being silent. The third one is do communication styles differ from one culture to the next? So you're trying to differentiate one culture to another when it comes to communication styles. Like for example, one particular culture like the Monobos. Okay, the other one is the Mangyans. The other one is the Aitas. Do they differ from uh, communication styles, or do they have different communication styles? So this is what we called the questions of relationship and the questions of differences. When quantitative researchers explores questions or differences or questions of relationship, they do so in attempt to uncover certain patterns of behavior. If the researcher discovers that a certain relationship exists in a sample that she or she has drawn from the population, she or he is in a position to draw generalization about patterns expected of human behavior. So that is the uh, relationship or the importance of quantitative research to behavioral sciences. How about in education and psychology? So according to Mertens in 2005, he says that the dominant paradigms that guided early educational and psychological research were positivism and its successor post-positivism. So positivism is based on the rationalistic empiricist philosophy that originated with Aristotle, Francis Bacon, John Locke, Auguste Comte, and Immanuel Kant. These underlying assumptions of positivism include the belief that the social world can be studied in the same way as the natural world, that there is a method of studying the social world that is value-free, and that explanation of the causal nature can be provided. So this is the difference between a positivist theory and interpretivism. So in here, in a positivism, the relationship between society and the individual usually shapes the individual, or the society shapes the individual. And society consists of social facts, which exercises coercive control over the individual. So the people's action can be generally be explained by the social norm that they have been exposed through their socialization. The second one is the general focus on social research. So the point of research is to uncover the laws that governs human behavior, just as scientists have discovered the laws that govern the physical world. So it usually prefers a quantitative method which allows for the researcher to remain detached from the respondents. So, meaning that the result of the study, or in the conduct of the study, the researcher is objective at all costs and not subjective. In the positivism, the preferred research methods would be uh, quantitative research, which requires research to be valid, reliable, and representativeness. So that is what we call positivism. The following table was done by Darwin, Bowles, and Benz in 1996, as cited in Mertens 2005 to illustrate this view of positivism. The research problem is very little is known about the victimization experience of adolescents with disabilities. So there are a lot of cases in their area in which adolescents are being victimized because of their disabilities. Yet, previous researchers have suggested that people with mental retardation are vulnerable to economic, psychological, and physical abuses. So the research question is that what are the predictors of victimization for a sample of adolescents with disabilities in transition from high school to adult life? Participants were students with disabilities who were identified by their schools as in their last year of high school, or who has dropped out of high school sometime during what would have been their last year. The sample size is 422. So the instrument and procedure used is a fixed response interview, which was conducted through telephone with students and their parents by trained interviewers. Predictor variables were selected based on the previous research. This includes gender, minority status, serious emotional disturbance, specific learning abilities, disability, dropout status, family socioeconomic status, parent training of academic skills, and a rating of personal social skills. The outcome variable of victimization was defined as experiencing more than one of the following: being teased or bothered, having something stolen from them, or being hit hard or beaten up. So the results: the following characteristics were associated with a greater likelihood of being victimized during the first year of school. Prior victimization, molested in school in the previous year, being female, having low past personal social achievement, and having both serious emotional disturbances and an arrest record within 1 year of leaving school. So their discussion is that the greater risk of victimization was for the group who had serious emotional disturbances and with low personal social achievement. The authors recommended increasing social skill training directed to these specific groups in terms of appropriate ways to behave in community setting where victimization could occur. So as we can see here, that the importance of quantitative research in psychology and in education always emphasizes the improvement of a certain procedure or rules in order for us to protect our society. So let's come to the second to the last um, field of that we will be studying when it comes to the importance of quantitative research. So we have this what we call social sciences. So quantitative approach are typically associated with positivism or positive perspective in social research. Hammersley in 1993, as cited by Hen, Weinstein Forward in 2006, provides a useful definition of this approach. The term quantitative method refers to the adoption of the natural science experiments as the model of scientific research, its key features being quantitative measurement of the phenomenon being studied and systematic control of the theoretical variables influencing those problems. Thus, the logic of such research is to collect data using standardized approaches on the range of variables. And the second one is for you to search for patterns of causal relationship between these variables. And the third one is for you to test given theory by confirming or denying precise hypotheses. So when you test theories by confirming or denying precise hypotheses, you will be employing statistical treatment. The methods employed in this type of quantitative social research are most typically the sample survey and the experiment, a method that is particularly popular in psychological researches. The sample survey is the most commonly used technique for gathering information, whether by quantitative or qualitative means. Surveys are based on using statistical sampling methods. By taking a representative sample from a given population and applying a standardized research instrument in the form of a structured questionnaire, surveys enables descriptive and explanatory generalization to be made about the population in question. And the last one is the experimental research. So experiments are most commonly used in psychological research and in the broad field of business studies in the form of action research. Experimental research is based on the researcher manipulating certain conditions in order to identify the relationship between particular variables, in the hope that it will explain cause and effect relationship. In seeking to measure the impact that one factor has on another by controlling all other factors that might have an effect, experimental research builds on the principle of positivist approach to science more than any other research technique. So experiments can be carried out in a laboratory or a field setting. Laboratory experiments is the most closely regulated method of experiments involving the introduction of certain conditions into a controlled environment that stimulates key characteristics of a natural environment. An example might be examining the extent to which the responses of a group of voters to question about political attitudes after exposures to a series of party election broadcasts might be different to another, yet identical groups' responses were not confronted with such images. Such experiments allows for very considerable time on behalf of the researcher who is able to effect change and observe the research participants' subsequent behavior. Social research is all around us. Educators, government officials, business managers, human service providers, and healthcare professionals regularly use social research methods and findings. People use social research to raise children, reduce crime, improve public health, sell products, or just understand one's life. So, this ends our lecture. So, I hope you understand the lesson. And if you have any queries, just send me questions in